So welcome everybody to the SATA webinar on diversity, and we're hosting Keith Tudor today. Keith, on behalf of our association, welcome. It's great to see you again. Keith and I first met face-to-face in San Francisco in 2014. I was very excited to meet him because I'd looked forward to the release of his book on co-creative transactional analysis, co-written with Graham Summers. And we hosted you last year. It was a very intriguing webinar. Thanks, Keith, and I'm even more excited about this one. Welcome.
I just worked out how to unmute. Kia ora, Alex. Kia ora koutou. Hello, everyone. It's great to be back and and with you. Are you handing over? Are we sort of starting?
Yeah.
I just wondered if there was anything else that we needed to do by way of connecting, or.
Yeah. So I'm reminded now of the question that I asked you beforehand. I was interested to see in your TA certifications that you note both CTA psychotherapy as well as TSTA psychotherapy. Maybe you could let us know your thinking behind that.
Okay. Can I? What I'd like to do is start with a greeting, and then I'll address that. So can I go to mute to sharing the screen?
Yes.
So what I'll do is I'll start and give a bit of a greeting, which I guess represents some of my interest in diversity and being an immigrant to this beautiful country, Aotearoa, New Zealand. And then I'll say a little bit, I'll address that question, but also catch what people's interest is in this topic. So I will now go to sharing the screen. So hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, it's showing up.
Yeah, good. And I can just see you now, Alex, but perhaps as other people talk, I'll see their pictures. So, so kia ora, hello, and I hope that covers most, if not all, of the languages of your beautiful country. So I won't attempt to pronounce them, but a warm welcome and hello from me. So I'm going to do what in New Zealand is called a pepeha, which is a traditional Māori greeting and positioning of myself. And then I'm going to be talking about, so I'm going to basically be talking about the context, starting off with that cultural context, talk a bit about theoretical diversity in practice, and lots of time for discussion. So, ko Helvellyn te Monga, my mountain is Helvellyn. Ko Don te Awa, my river is the Don that flows through Sheffield in the UK. Ko Waka Oranga te Waka, my canoe is the Waka of Health, which is an organisation of Māori and non-Māori psychotherapists and healthcare providers in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Ko Ingarihi, ko Werihi ngā iwi. I come from English and Welsh ancestry, and I've recently done a DNA test. It came through, the results which came through last week, and I also have Irish and Scottish ancestry, so I'll be adding to my pepeha. Ko Tudor he tangata, my iwi, my hapu is the Tudors, my, if you like, sub-tribe, and ko Lewin Tudor he tangata, Lewin Tudor is my most known furthest back ancestor. He tangata tiriti aho. In this country, I regard myself as a person of the treaty, which is the Treaty of Waitangi that was signed between Māori chiefs and the British Crown in 1840. And as a tauiwi, as somebody who is a new tribe, I'm sort of signing up for that partnership with tangata whenua, the people of the land. So I say I'm a person of the treaty. He tangata tiriti aho. Ko Ngā Waio Horatiu, ko Whaiora, ko Awataha Ngā Marae. These are marae that I am associated with. One is the University Marae, one is the Home Marae of Waka Oranga, the organisation I'm involved with, and another one is Awataha Marae, which is a marae local to that has strong connections with the discipline of psychotherapy. And one of the things that I am at AUT is Professor of Psychotherapy. Ko Sheffield ke Ingarangi aho. I'm from Sheffield in the United Kingdom, in England. I should say the disunited kingdom at the moment. Ko Titirangi ke Waitakere aho e noho ana, which is so it means I live in Titirangi in the Waitakere in West Auckland. Ke te whenua o te Kawero Amaki toku kaianga Inaine. That means I live on the ancestral grounds of the iwi or the hapu of Kawero Amaki. This is the local tribe, and that's the po that represents their ancestors. Ko Keith Tudor Takawingwa. My name is Keith Tudor. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Warm greetings from me to you. So yes, I wanted to offer that as what I tend to do here, minus the translation, but as a way of grounding myself and of acknowledging my place in this country. And I think for me that first and foremost expresses not only diversity but also unity. And I think when we talk about diversity, I also want to talk about unity, because I think both are fairly difficult to talk about, but I don't want to sort of polarize and only talk about diversity. So in some of that pepiha, I'm expressing my uniqueness, but I'm also expressing my connection. And what you may realize is that I start wider and move inwards. So I start with references to geography and landscape and connection and whakapapa or genealogy and so on and so on. And the very last thing I say, and this is I should say this is a relatively short version of the pepiha, but the very last thing you say is who you are as an individual, which I think is an interesting place to start with conversations about diversity and unity. So I think what I'll do, I'll try and work between stop sharing and sharing, because I can only see you, Alex. So if I stop sharing for the moment, and then I can see more of you, so because I can't see your reactions. So at this point, I'd like to say, warm welcome from me. I really appreciate being invited to speak with you, and it does feel like I want to speak with you rather than to you. But I think at this point I'd like to throw it open a little bit and hear from each of you. So we make this a sort of webinar seminar, and to perhaps find your way of introducing yourself, however you do introduce yourself, and also your interest in diversity and anything else, and I guess within the sort of broad TA context.
Let me be bold and start. I felt quite humbled observing your introduction, Keith, and it made me more cognizant of where I am now and what's happened in the physical space or the geographical space that I'm presently in, that I'm probably largely unaware of. So all the people and the flora and fauna that have lived in my space. And it's also made me, perhaps in my mind, trying to go through the same process of starting in the bigger picture and then coming down to me. It's made me think that I'm quite disconnected from my own ancestry, although maybe more on a spiritual or emotional level. Cognitively, I know most of where I come from. So I have Scottish and Dutch ancestry. Yeah, and I do feel quite out of place where I am at the moment. And my name is Alex van Westphalen. I'm a coach. I'm very passionate about TA, and I intend to make a difference to people's lives through coaching, use of TA, supervision, and relating to them generally outside of those specific modalities. I'm the Vice Chair of the South African TA Association and happy to contribute there as well. Welcome.
Thank you, Alex.
I'll jump in. So hi there, Keith and everyone else. It's good to see some familiar faces. I'm Denise Hunt and I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa. I too am absolutely warmed and touched by your greeting, Keith. And just like that, I was immediately brought in touch with a lot of interest and some turmoil. Having been born and bred in South Africa, we have an interesting history and found ourselves in a continued challenging space. And at the same time, that's, I suppose, the heart of my work, is that I am a coach. I work in non-profits as well as profits, corporates. And I'm very passionate about diversity and transformation, which has been a key element on the agenda for sort of 25 years, post-democracy in South Africa. And it's often just organizations and people paying lip service to it. And yeah, I suppose I just think about many things. I grew up in a white racist family who have grown, and I've seen personally that transformation can and does take place in our country and around the world. And there's also a huge backlash in our country around the world, around difference and exclusion. And I guess also being part of a multicultural family, I'm very much about inclusion and I'm always wrestling with owning my own privilege and being really intentional and meaningful around getting alongside people and inviting inclusion. So I think it's an incredibly exciting topic on the table today, and I'm really pleased to be here.
Kia ora, thank you, Denise. It's good to hear some of your background. I was thinking about that you know, that sort of movement that you see in your family. I have a brother who emigrated to Australia and was one of the last 10-pound POMs. And I think, although we both came from quite a liberal family, he was more conservative. And certainly, you know, he celebrated the 200th anniversary of Australia by sending me a T-shirt, you know, and I sort of sent him stuff about, you know, Indigenous Australians back, sort of the picture of an Aboriginal man planting the Aboriginal flag on the White Cliffs of Dover and claiming Britain for the Aboriginal people, you know. So, but I have seen him also change and welcome things like the call to country that a lot of Australians do now, or in the sort of public health sort of sector rituals. And so it's interesting that he and I are sort of, I mean, I'm probably a bit more over here, but I can see that journey, so I can relate to that. Appreciate your kōrero, your conversation. Look forward to more. Thank you.
I'll jump in. I'm Jayashree. Yeah. Namaskara. Namaste. Vanakkam. So I'm from India. I'm from the southern part of India, Coimbatore. Yeah. So for me, when you said unity and diversity, that's what I have been growing up with, these slogans, because India is a very diverse country. And I am from Karnataka, Bangalore. So for 30 years, I have lived in that state, and I moved out of that state to a different state, Tamil Nadu. And I experienced a cultural shock. It was for me uh, quite, I was very agitated with this diversity. The states in the same country is different. And that was quite a shocking experience for me. And over the years, now I've been in Tamil Nadu for nearly 15 years. And I think I started telling myself, live in Rome as Romans do, and acknowledge the different aspects. There was so much of diversity, but then again, I see there is some commonalities between all of us here. And if I look at my ancestry, of course, I think I have my ancestors from all the southern states of India and from a few northern states of India. So yeah, that has been an I think really evolving experience for me to know that it's okay to be diverse, and it's okay to learn new things. And uh, I am now a trainee of Karen, specializing in educational TA. And I had a interesting experience because I'm conducting workshops, play shops for children. And in one of those play shops, I was sharing a story from an Hindu mythological this one. And then when I took supervision, the question asked was, what if it's a diverse group? The children are from diverse religions. Then you're talking about one Hindu mythology. So that has been really bothering me. Is it okay to own up to your own whatever it is and talk about it? Or am I influencing young minds? So that has there is still a question for me, and I'm looking forward to exploring that here. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you. My first trip to India was to Coimbatore, to the inaugural conference of the South Asian Association for Transactional Analysis, where I met Karen, and we shared a taxi ride around Kerala, and it was lovely. So I've got very good associations with Coimbatore. So thank you. And as far as mythology goes, I mean, we can explore this and talk about this, but I was thinking, because TA is a Western mythology.
Mm-hmm.
So why wouldn't we, it's a story, it's a narrative, and I'm saying this particularly from a constructivist perspective. So why wouldn't we tell our Māori legends, Hindu stories, and so on? Because TA is just another story. It's not a neutral story. It's not the sort of neutral center. And so in that sense, I think we're all influencing each other all the time. But anyway, more of that anon. Thank you.
I'll go next. My name is Anand, and it's a privilege to be part of this discussion. And I re-entered India after being away for nearly 39 years from Canada. And so I'm rediscovering my re-entry, the cultural diversity, which is my culture, and I'm being away and coming back. So it's fascinating that this was so timely, this discussion. So I want to take part and benefit as much as I can. I'm an army brat. My father was in the army, British Army, and I lived, being the youngest, lived in several provinces in India. And as a young kid, I adapted to many languages just to fit in and belong. And then going to Canada. Like India, diversity is our unity. And whereas in Canada, searching for our diversity is our identity. And so coming back, re-entry is a challenging experience, but also a very enriching experience in finding the nuances of culture, and also cultures of different institutions and organizations. It's very different, and individually having to discover that. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm happy to go next. I'm Karen, and yes, Keith, I was remembering that taxi we shared in Coimbatore, looking around. I was very jet lagged, having just done many hours of traveling, but it was a wonderful introduction to you and the TA world when I was still a very new TA person. I'm also born, lived in South Africa, so come with all that complexity of what is the same, what is different. My kind of philosophical, spiritual exploration is around non-duality, and at the same time, almost that paradox of how can I hold that there is only one essence, whatever name we give to it, but within that there's uniqueness as well. So it always feels for me a bit of a paradox of how do I hold both? And certainly for me, there's something about the quality of beingness that seems paramount in the doing. In all my own ongoing work in various contexts, that seems to come back to me time and time again. Who am I being that impacts what I'm doing? So yeah, I'm fascinated to see where we go today. Lovely to be here, Keith.
Lovely to see you again, Karen. I'm sorry you couldn't join us last time. We just got a brief wave, but yeah, maybe this is going to be like a taxi ride around a few provinces. Lovely to see you again.
I'll go next. Hi, Keith. Hi, everybody. Yeah, very, very interesting introduction. And it certainly got me thinking about where I see myself and how I see myself in terms of my own journey. I think what you did for me this morning, Keith, was you opened up a whole world of the embracing our whole journey and seeing the importance of where we come from. And I've always known that, but I've never really unpacked it or seen it the way that you brought it forward this morning. So that was absolutely beautiful. And I love to learn and be mindful of new spaces. Interestingly enough, in the last month or two, my eldest sister has been to visit, and she's fascinated by our family tree. And just the conversation around that and where we come from. And, you know, we have a bit of French ancestry within our family as well. So it's very interesting, but I actually really don't know enough about where I come from. So it's, you've piqued a curiosity within me this morning. So thank you very much for that. In terms of the space this morning, 2 months ago, I had to do a diversity workshop, something that was very in terms of looking at cultural markers and what have you. So I had to take a little bit of a dive myself into how to pull together a webinar of that, or not a webinar, a workshop. And there were some interesting conversations and some difficult conversations through the course of the morning. And I guess what I'm wanting to do, the word diversity popped up, and I thought, oh, I need to take this subject deeper for myself. So I'm interested to look at it through a TA lens this morning. So thank you very much. Lovely to be part of.
Great, thank you. And do feel free to contribute, because I'm sure you've probably got some tips and things from your work. So I'm looking forward to this being a very much a dialogue.
Thank you, Keith.
Can I come in next? I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Am I there?
I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, hi, it's Marguerite Sacco. I have quite a bad connection, so I might freeze now and then, but it seems to last for just a number of seconds, so I'll be back. Okay, so Marguerite Sacco, I was born in South Africa in a place called Eshowe in KwaZulu-Natal. I was raised in Johannesburg and I now live in Cape Town. I was born to a South African mother who was of Irish and English descent, and a French Maltese father who was born in Egypt. So quite a diverse background, yes.
You have frozen.
Smith, she lives in Abu Dhabi and works there. And am I gone again? Am I back? Can you hear me?
You're back.
All right. I was saying my husband lives and works in Abu Dhabi. I visit him there, and I've started to do a bit of work there as well. My interest in diversity there is learning how to work in a very different culture to my own. And the great interest for me is to look for and find what is common and what lights us all up. And I really am enjoying what I'm seeing in the Middle East, and how there is so much that is different, and then now and then there are these wonderful sparks of sameness and oneness that you can use, and that works so well in the organizational development setting. I run diversity workshops in South Africa for a number of organizations as well. And so that is also a part of my interest in this workshop, is how I can add to what I present when I work. And there you go.
Oh, thank you. I feel privileged to be in the midst of people really dealing with this and working with this. So I do hope that we can have some conversations, and maybe some things will come out of this. Who knows? Thank you, Alex. I'm going to just ask you about the Marguerite's connection. I know it's obviously preferable to see you, but I'm wondering in terms of the bandwidth, whether if you knock the camera off, you get a more stable sound. I just do that when things are a bit unstable in terms of connection. So
yeah,
but
that
I
works.
don't know if that's So I think I'd rather have your consistent sound, Marguerite, than the visual. But perhaps if the bandwidth, you can from time to time just check in with us and visually.
All right.
Thank you. Does that work for you?
I'll try that. See how it goes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Oh wow, what a lovely start. So yeah, people do feel free to for the others who haven't checked in to check in.
I have a little lady next to me who's fine and she's sick and it's a tough bit today. And I was very humble about your introduction because I studied in Auckland and very warm memories of that time and just you presented.
Inga?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Can I ask you to put yourself closer to the microphone? We're really struggling to hear. It's very soft.
What do I have to do?
Maybe just speak closer to the microphone.
I don't really know where it is, to be honest. Can you hear me better now?
That's a bit better, yes.
Okay. So I was very humbled by your presentation. I studied in New Zealand and many years ago, so it was just wonderful to see all these pictures, and which brought me back to my international and intercultural things. I'm now based in Hamburg, which is not my hometown in Germany, which is further away, and I don't really feel that connected to this area yet, despite having the kids here. But it's like finding my place again, and I've always the intercultural international fields.
Sorry, I'm also losing you quite a lot. I don't know if you can do something with the microphone or the volume.
Can you put up? But you can't put up the volume for.
That's better.
Yeah, you won't have technical control over your volume, but you'll be able to speak very close to the microphone, and then we can hear you.
Try to speak louder maybe as well.
Yeah, okay. Yep. So you said I just lost you. You're talking about finding your place because you're living in Hamburg?
I'm now based in Hamburg in Germany.
Yeah.
Hamburg. But I feel very international because I've just lived in different parts of the world, studied in different parts of the world, worked there as well. So that's just my background. But the funny thing is, most members of my family don't really have this international interest. So I'm the one who is awkward and not really being at home in the village and all these things. When I'm coming to them, I'm a strange person. They don't really understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing this thing, why I'm so much interested in it.
Yeah.
So this is as well my TA background, which comes from Great Britain. So that's different again. I don't have that much connections to the TA connection in Germany. So it's just not really my home TA land, I would call it. And besides that, I'm lecturing, so I'm in human resource management, and I'm very interested in using TA in all these fields with a very systemic and intercultural perspective. So I'm facilitating groups, giving workshops, and all that, and I always use lots of TA for that. And within the last years, I worked with a friend together on a lot of concepts in TA and developed aspects, how we could use that in intercultural training and diversity training and that. And yeah, so I'm very keen on that. So I'm very lucky that I can be here with you and put these things together in this international group. That's just
Great, thank you. Just keep an eye on this on the sound because it's very quiet. So yeah, try and do something with that. Look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you.
I'm Andrew. I'm based in Pretoria in South Africa. I'm born and raised in South Africa by Welsh parents who were born and grew up in Wales, and I'm the youngest of 3 children, and I'm the only one that's born in South Africa, which is a bit of an interesting thing to recognize, that I am sort of have a different base compared to the rest of my immediate family. What I found quite interesting in my own getting to know myself as I grow up is seeing how where I thought things were quite liberal, and then finding out when I tested the liberalness in the family, it actually wasn't very liberal at all. So in particular, actually I hold a story quite dear about my mom. When she first moved to South Africa, was looking in a music store, and she picked up a record, and the shop assistant came and said to her, "Ma'am, you do know that's a black musician?" And she looked at the person and said, "Yes, and?" So I hold that story quite dear. And then when I tried to test like I said, the liberalness of the family got pushed quite hard back. So so the way I did that is I am gay, and when I came out, it wasn't accepted very well in the family. And then it seems like over time, my brother and my sister have also taken their own versions of testing the liberalness of my dear mom now, because my dad passed away quite a few years ago. So what I find interesting at the moment is getting to know myself, where I come from, dealing with my own style of resilience, and what I've been connecting with more recently is how resilience, sense of diversity, and self-discipline, how closely they're all interrelated, and the golden thread that goes through them. And then what I've touching on the story points that we've heard so far of change being possible. My mom, she always speaks about me being her, I don't know, confidant or something like that, and I push quite hard to challenge her when I feel like she's being too ignorant, for the lack of a better word, of diversity, and am often very pleasantly surprised at how well she takes it on and is able to look at herself and then update her ways. So I take a lot of from my initial experience of holding my mom's story in high regard, also now holding her in high regard in her ability to change, even in her advanced years. So that's a brief check-in from me. I'm also involved with SATAA. I'm the secretary, and really appreciative of the opportunity to be involved in this community, and wonderful to get to meet you, Keith, and hear your introduction and everybody's introductions.
Croeso, welcome in Welsh. And I'm also the youngest of three. And interestingly, picking up on the point that Jayashri made earlier about Hindu mythology, I've been working on a paper about the position of a third person in a culture. So indigenous, early settlers who then settle, and then the new tribe. And as I've been talking with my cultural advisors, I have 2 cultural advisors, which may be something else for us to talk about. And they introduced me to this idea in Māori, the word potiki, which means the third. But it also has a whole mythology to it of being the third, if you like, the therapeutic third, the mischievous, the one who's mischievous, who pushes things apart a bit. And so in the paper, I've done a whole riff on being potiki, and it's one of those examples, as I was saying to you about the Hindu, where it's actually added a dimension that I hadn't had. I mean, I've been a third all my life. The Helvellyn is the 3rd highest mountain in the English lakes, which is significant in terms of that's my mountain. It's the 3rd highest, not the 1st or the 2nd. So there's all sorts of thirds in my life, but I've now got this huge different cultural richness to it from a completely different story. So I think that's one of the things where I think diversity actually enhances us within, as it were. So but again, we maybe pick some of this up later, but thank you. In Māori, we would be seen as Whanonga family, because we're both Welsh, so we must be related somewhere.
I'll go next. Well, I think I'm the last, actually. Hi, everybody. Hi, Keith. Listening to all your introductions, I've been sitting here thinking, well, how do I sum up me in a brief minute? So my mom's family came from Kent in the UK, where I actually ended up living for a couple of years and loved it. And my dad's family is Jewish and comes from Lithuania. So a bit of diversity there. I was raised, I went to a Jewish school, which was interesting because I don't really identify as that, but it is part of my history. And the more I explore Eastern philosophies...
Sorry, we're getting a lot of background noise. I don't know if it's from you. Somebody doing the dishes?
Yeah, someone's doing the dishes.
Okay, it sounds like...
It's right on the other side of this wall.
Oh, okay, all right.
All right, I'll keep it quick. Yeah, so the more I explore more Eastern philosophies, the more I feel like I'm coming home. And the work that I do is I'm a life coach, and I also run workshops based in TA. I love TA. And I'm noticing that my clients are starting to shift and they're becoming more and more diverse. So I guess that's my interest in the topic today, is knowing, well, yeah, I feel like the more I encounter more diverse clients, the more it challenges my own frame of reference, which I love. And it's finding out the bits that are common between us, because there's always something. Yeah. So I'm interested in the topic, and I'm interested in always learning more TA. I'm the treasurer for the SATAA, so it's a part of that. And yeah, I don't know. I guess that's it. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you all. I know that's taken a bit of time, but I do think there is something, you know, diversity is very personal as well as political. And so I really appreciate your sharing, and I think it already warms the space between us. It feels, I have a strange sense of not feeling the distance. You know, it feels like we're quite close. So I'm really, you know, curious about that. Before I was actually going to, I'm going to say, because I'm quite co-creative in my approach to working, the next bit, I'm just going to sort of put something in that I wasn't going to say, but I think it's highly relevant. And there's a couple of things about my background. One is, and that, you know, this is essentially a bit of the autobiography of why I'm interested in diversity. My father was English and was a German teacher. And as a result of his contact with people in Germany, this is back in the late 30s, he, and his religious views, he was a conscientious objector in the Second World War. So as a result of that, I think that's partly gives me my sense of being able to object to things conscientiously and be a bit critical. But it also opened me up to ideas about internationalism. And we had lots of German exchange students and so on. So I learned, you know, how to say willkommen and, you know, just to sort of, Entschuldigen Sie, and, you know, a few phrases that were sort of welcoming. And then we went to Germany and I played with kids. And sadly, I didn't ever learn German, partly because I was a bit in awe of I think my father had a very strong Be Perfect driver, which I sort of inherited. So I sort of went, ooh, didn't want to make a mistake. But I think that that just sort of made me an internationalist before I even knew the word. And then in my 30s, and then I was involved in political movements that were quite international, and including anti-apartheid struggles, you know, from the UK. And then I went to live in Italy for 2 years in my mid-30s, essentially because I wanted to learn Italian. And in the middle year, I remember very much throwing myself into things and loving all, you know, Italian food and culture, and it was World Cup, so they were good at football, and, you know, in a way slightly running down English, being English. And then I had this sort of epiphany in the middle year where I was going to go back, and then I decided to stay for another year. And I suddenly realized, you know, I'm English, and there are some good things about, you know, English culture and where I come from and Shakespeare and, you know, all of that stuff. And so I had this sort of moment of saying, okay, so I'm still interested in being in Italy. I'm still interested in learning Italian, which I did. But I also wanted to hold the fact that I have this English culture. And it's interesting that when I went back to the UK, and this is in 1987, and I went back and started my TA training, that I started being approached by a lot of people from different cultures wanting to work cross-culturally with me. And I remember, I'd be the white guy, and there would be an Asian trainer, and we both do some diversity stuff. And I remember talking to one guy and said, why do you want to work with me? Because he was very different politically. And he said, I trust you because you know who you are. And specifically, I know you know who you are culturally. So you're not doing this thing where culture becomes and diversity becomes exotic or demonized. And so I think I wanted to tell you that story really because I feel passionate about, you know, learning Te Reo Māori and doing introductions, and that's partly a leadership role that I have in the university. But I do so not from a sort of I want to be Māori. I do so because I know I'm English. I want to be embracing of, if you like, diversity. So I suppose I wanted to offer you that story as a bit more of a personal rationale as to why I'm here and interested in this subject. And that rather neatly takes us into the question that Alex, you asked some time ago about the CTA thing. And because Alex said, why are you CTA and TSTA? Because most TSTAs, when they become transactional, teaching and supervising transactional analysts, that's just it. But if you think about it a bit closely, that designation describes the teaching and supervision aspect of TA. It doesn't still describe the clinical. It's somehow like the clinical gets lost in that designation. And there was a bit of a debate some years ago, or when I was in the UK, so sort of 20 years ago to about 10 years ago, where some people who remained CTAs who didn't want to go on and become trainers or supervisors felt like they were being sort of second-class citizens somehow. It was like, oh, they've only got a CTA, or they're just a CTA, rather than, you know, wow, you're committed to clinical practice or organizational practice or whatever, and that's really important. And we only need some people to go on to be teaching and supervising transactional analysts. So ever since that, and I said, look, I want to join this senior practitioners group separate from my TSTA thing. So from then on, I've always put CTA, which describes my clinical identity, and TSTA, which describes my teaching and supervisory identity. And I guess, again, that sort of relates to ideas about plurality, diversity and plurality. Whoops. I hope that answers your question, Alex.
It does. Thank you. Yeah, I like the disruption, if you will, of the kind of hierarchy, because it's more acknowledging of where people feel they belong, I guess, or it's got something to do with identity as well.
Yeah, that's my intention. And as you know, I do tend to disrupt hierarchies, including the parent ego state, which we'll come on to. So, so I now do want to just share another section of my slides, and I'm going to do that by pressing the share button. Okay, so we're back to Arataki. So the next thing, I'm very interested in honoring elders. And again, that comes from my own history, but also particularly influenced by Māori culture. And so one of the, wait a minute, I've just lost the slides for some reason on my, oh, here we go. Sorry, for some reason that seems to have frozen, and I got, can you see from current slide? Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So I trained at Metanoia with 3 South Africans. And I want to acknowledge them as my part of my TA whakapapa. So the woman on the left is Patricia Clarkson. The woman in the middle is Sue Fish. And they're both very good pictures in terms of capturing something of their particular character. And the man at the bottom is Brian Dobson, and I was in various professional relationships, therapy, supervision with all of them at various times, and they were very much part of my development as a transactional analyst. And Metanoia was very influenced by the fact that these were 3 South African emigres, yeah, so I suppose it felt important to acknowledge, them, and I think particularly Sue and Brian somewhat underrated in terms of, Patricia was such a larger than life character that, but Sue taught me a lot about working with children. Brian was my first TA supervisor. Sadly died, shortly after that year. But yeah, good people and part of my intellectual, the ancestors of my mind, as somebody here talks about. I thought I would also want to acknowledge the Rainbow Nation and that sort of move from, I was thinking about what's the opposite of diversity, or I thought, well, maybe from adversity, or from the sort of sense of, colonial one nation, one truth sort of thing, to your Rainbow Nation, which I know is complex and not easy, and maybe that's something else we'll be referring to. I appreciate what some of you said about the tensions. I think Denise, you were talking about it in your check-in. The other bit of context that I usually start with when I do presentations here around about psychotherapy and theory is one of the first books that I read when I landed here was this book called Southern Theory, which is by an Australian sociologist called Raewyn Connell. And in that book, she describes Southern theory as informed by the view that colonized and peripheral societies produce social thought about the modern world, which has as much intellectual power as metropolitan social thought and more political relevance. And the particular phrase that got me, and it sort of struck me in my gut, you know, when you read things, you sort of take it in intellectually. This I sort of, it was almost like a clap. It was like a bolt of lightning. It just sort of boom, got me in the stomach, as it were. This phrase, since the ground is different, the form of theorizing is often different too. And this really speaks to the point I made earlier about, you know, Hindu mythology, Western mythology. I'm very persuaded by the idea that where the ground is different, we have to think and be open to the idea that the theory is different. So, for instance, in landing in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in, you know, getting involved in psychotherapy education, my interest is what was here before, what was here first. How does Te Ao Māori, how does the Māori world understand Hinenaro, which is a broad translation of, you know, spirit, soul healing? That, where do we start from? Where's the ground? Where's our place? Where's our Turanga Waiwa? Where's our place to stand? What is our mountain? What does Helvellyn mean to me? You know, what's the theory that it gives me? What's the theory that the Waitakere gives me? So I'm very disruptive, I suppose, of the assumption that Western theory is even relevant. I think it has to prove its point. And so I tend to start with Southern theory. And because I tend to write about these things, writing is a form of learning for me. I wrote an article in a journal that I now edit called Psychotherapy and Politics International. And I wrote basically taking Raewyn Connell's theory and then applying it to psychotherapy. So I had fun with that. And as you can see, that was my early pepeha as a start to sort of locate me. So as somebody who also lives in the Southern Hemisphere, I'm interested in that we talk about Western theory, but we don't talk so much about that Western theory also being Northern theory. So I said at the original slide, and my plan is to sort of pause every so often. So I just want to talk a little bit about, so essentially I want to talk about two things. One is the theoretical diversity within TA, and then how we can use TA concepts to think about diversity. And that's really where I want to throw it open to more conversation. So I've always been aware of the fact that there are different traditions in TA, and some of us go back to the days when there was the old three schools. And in fact, when I did my CTA qualifying exam in 1994, part of the criteria was you had to be aware of theories within the three schools. Now that criteria has changed to talk about approaches, but in the old days, in old money, we talked about schools, and actually a number of people identified more than the old three schools. Robin Hobbs, who's an English transactional analyst, and myself wrote about different traditions. We identified 6 different traditions. Leonard Campos talks about the tree of TA and various branches, and Sir Vas van Beekom, who's an Australian colleague, Dutch-Australian colleague, talks about branches of TA. And José Gregoire, who's a French transactional analyst, talks about different approaches. And here is one I prepared earlier. So various people have presented this in different ways, but what I wanted to do for you is to present this in a sense of how the different authors have identified different traditions. So if you read across, you've got the old classical, sort of classical Burnian tradition, and then each of those authors, actually apart from Willems and Brown, have acknowledged that as a, if you like, approach. And then cathexis is recognized as an approach or a school, etc., and so on and so on. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about this chart is, and I'm grateful to Charlotte Sills for pointing this out. She first said to me years and years ago that she thought that what used to be referred as the classical school actually should be divided into classical psychodynamic or psychoanalytic and cognitive behavioral, because if you think about Byrne's own movement from psychoanalysis to TA, some of the ideas in TA are quite psychodynamic or have psychodynamic sort of heritage, like I would say script theory, and indeed even ego state theory comes from ego psychology and Federn's ideas. But you also have this sort of cognitive behavioral stuff about, you know, contracting, about options, about behavioral operations and so on. So since she offered me that, I tend to think of the classical as divided into that psychoanalytic and cognitive behavioral, and that's quite important in terms of when we get to ideas about the relational TA, because relational TA, in my view, is seen predominantly as psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, whereas certainly I would see my work with Graham on co-creative as coming from a much more humanistic tradition. So I'm aware there's quite a lot to go through, but you'll have the slides so you can sort of ponder on this afterwards. Some traditions like Asclepion, Huron Valley, mini-script, social transaction either don't exist anymore, but again, as part of honouring the tradition, I wanted to point that out. Asclepion is particularly interesting because it was basically TA used in a prison facility back in the late 70s. Now, I don't know of anywhere else, I don't know of anywhere currently that uses TA in prisons, but if anybody does, then they should probably read stuff about Asclepion, which is published. And then you come on to the other, you know, more since Byrne died, you know, there was an explosion of you know, different ideas, integrative, obviously, particularly associated with Richard Erskine, but also Patricia Clarkson, constructivist, which is probably where I put myself in some ways, systemic, and so on. So that I would suggest that is the diversity that we actually have within TA, and that's just naming the traditions and authors who've clustered those traditions. That's not even getting into what are the differences about how we might work differently with people. So just on this section, some comments on that. I think the chart's useful in offering an overview. But it is a list of lists. It doesn't necessarily compare like with like. So for instance, you know, when people talk about the relational school, I would say, do you mean relational psychodynamic as you know, Hargaden and Sills and, you know, people like Ray Little, who, as we know, just won the Eric Byrne Memorial Award. And so, you know, congratulations to him for that. But it's also, I'd say, co-creative is relational. So, you know, psychodynamic relational is a relational perspective, but co-creative is another perspective. There's obviously differences between how different authors think about this diversity. So if you read those articles, those, you know, 7 articles about the different schools of TA, you'll get different ideas about what constitutes a school. Some authors move across schools, and in fact, Adrian Lee has produced a chart, lovely, it's partly lovely because it's colourful and so on, and she talks about classical and constructivist, and she has me down in both schools, which I think is interesting, or both areas of change. So some people are, you know, Richard Erskine I've seen referred to as psychodynamic as well as integrative and so on. And also, not all of those approaches are practiced everywhere. So when I talk about say in New Zealand, which has a very small community, rather like South Africa, probably 60 people at the most. I'd say most would be quite classical, and then the rest would be relational psychodynamic. So I think you also get different clusters depending on spheres of influence and so on. And finally, of course, it's impossible to know about all of this because the TA literature is exponential, and I sometimes feel quite sorry for new CTAs because they're sort of have to, or people are preparing for their CTA exam. Essentially, the danger is they have to know much more than we had to I had to know in 1994, because the literature, the TA literature, has grown exponentially. So I'll just pause there and get back to you in terms of the first bit about, you know, theoretical diversity, and yeah, I'd just like to throw it open to, you know, comments or reflections or any other schools that you might have up your sleeve. Feel free.
I don't have anything really in terms of other schools, but what I do find is when I really enjoy learning about myself using TA, and then when I take the time to look at this foundational information, I start to feel quite overwhelmed, and potentially thinking that my intention is to do my CTA in the future, get quite anxious. I think my hands are already starting to sweat at the thought of needing to get through all of this stuff and commit it to memory. But I suppose it's also good to know that there are lots of people that have taken the time to make lists of lists, which potentially is a good place to start.
I'm aware that I might have contributed to your overwhelm, Andrew, but I suppose I did it partly because I do want to, I keep wanting to remind people that there is diversity. So one of the things I was reading before the webinar was a dialogue between Claude Steiner, who represented radical psychiatry, and Michele Novellino, who's an Italian psychoanalytic transactional analyst. And it's a fierce dialogue. It's actually a lovely article if you can get off the TAJ. But, you know, Claude is saying, who was a friend of mine, it was saying, you know, TA moved away from psychoanalysis, and, you know, we're going backwards, and, you know, I'm defending TA, you know, like pure TA, and Michele is saying, well, you know, it has psychoanalytic roots, and some of us do find psychodynamic concepts useful in working with the unconscious processes and so on and so on. The reason I mention that is because to me, in my mind, there is no one TA, and there's certainly no one true TA. And I'm quite fiercely anti-dogmatic. And I've written about that elsewhere, both within TA and outside of TA. And part of the reason that I present that is it's a bit like, you know, you pay your money and you buy your theory. So I think there's theory that would suit each one of us. I'm obviously more drawn to, and I'll say later, I'm more drawn to radical psychiatry and obviously co-creative than others. And I can get by with writing an article without referencing psychodynamic ideas. But then there's other people in TA who are entirely psychodynamic, psychoanalytic, and there's other people that are still redecision. There's still people doing cathexis in therapeutic communities, not least in India. So, you know, I think it's about, that's why I want to present this first as theoretical diversity. So it's not about having to know everything. I only know this stuff after having been involved in TA for 35 years and pretty widely read. So I think as somebody approaching their CTA, it's more about finding the theories that support your thinking and your practice, rather than knowing them all. It's impossible to know them all.
Mm-hmm.
So
that helps a lot. That's how you ended off that. It speaks to how I checked in about learning about myself and my journey of showing up.
Sorry, I was saying yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. And the CTA journey is a journey of personal integration. So that's all you can only. It's a bit like, you know, Luther when he nailed the theses to the door at Württemberg. He said, you know, here I stand, I can do no other. You know, you can't be other than yourself. But what I think we need is the theory to support us. rather than the one true theory.
And I think there's a beauty in it that it is so wide in theory, especially in different countries of the world. So that's at least something what I, in the culture field, really appreciate. Because we really can say that it's not one theory developed in one part of the world, but despite of that, it's just everywhere, and you can choose different theories, and they're not even connected with each other. They tell you different things, which they're just in itself different. So that's I think it's a big beauty. And having the psychoanalytic roots of TA is one thing, and the other is to use it in different fields of education and organization. And I like the background of TA despite using it.
Are there any other thoughts about the diversity of theory?
I like what you said, Keith, about I can only be who I am as a TA professional. And I'm also thinking in across the different fields. I'm an educator, so in the developmental fields, I often say to my trainees, it's what does the context call for? And go wild, take something and use it that's going to meet the needs of the people, not be proper theory, as it were. Otherwise it becomes theory for theory's sake, almost.
You might be interested to know that the book I'm currently working on is a book of critiquing TA, and the working title is TA Proper and Improper. TA proper refers to the traditional idea of analysing transactions, but we also need to analyse TA and say, is it doing the job? Is it sufficient for us? Does it explain, racism and so on? And I think it can, but I think we need to do a bit more work on that.
And I think there's a part of it you touched on earlier as well, is the thing of its Western theory used almost in every part of the world. So I find, sometimes speak to people about like colonizing. So we need to be careful how and where we use it.
I mean, a good example of that is some of the work that I was thinking about, the central idea of autonomy. TA has this idea, autonomy is where it's at. That's what we're aiming for. That's the expression of, almost the highest expression of the individual. Well, that comes from a particular, I think, very neoliberal, pre-neoliberal American intellectual tradition, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, American dream, particular historical moment, the burnt, post-war, etc. He didn't talk about homonymy. He didn't talk about belonging. He didn't talk about we are. He didn't talk about Ubuntu. I'm not saying, I'm criticizing him for not talking about all these things, but things move on. So whenever I talk about autonomy, I also talk about homonymy, which is the drive to belonging, that sits alongside the drive for self-determination. So I think this is exactly the sort of development of theory that we need to be making. I should say, perhaps before we move on to some ideas about working with diversity, that I also explain co-creative TA as my and Graham's personal integration of TA. There's a very specific story about how we came to it, which is that we both had moved away from TA. I'd gone to more sort of person-centered Rogerian psychology, Graham to Gestalt. And we both sort of sat down and said, if we're going to be transactional analysts, we have to question the theory and sort of, make our peace with different aspects of theory. So the whole co-creative TA thing, which was celebrating 20 years next year. So because our first article came out in 2000 and we've been writing about this for nearly, 20 years, is actually our sort of personal working through of our sort of relationship, intellectual, personal professional relationship, clinical relationship with TA. And in a sense, I think that's what we all have. That's what we're all doing at some level. Not everybody might write books about it, but you know, we all sort of have to make our own way, and we like some bits and we don't like other bits, and so on. So yeah, as you can see, I feel quite passionately about that.
Keith, just to say that this discussion has just put so many light bulbs on in my head, because I didn't realize that there was this richness. And so I've always said, oh no, I'm not going to do my CTA. I love TA and I use it a lot in my work, but there are things that I grapple with, and that's, I mean, my knowledge is very basic. But suddenly with you sharing this, it's opened up a massive Pandora's box to me. So thank you. I'm learning.
Wow. Thank you. I'm glad to give you hope, because that's what the Pandora's box was about.
Yeah, you see, I'm a maverick, so I suppose I'm related to so many of the things that you're saying. I'm saying, really? So thank you. I'm listening.
So shall I perhaps move on a bit to some ideas about working, well, again, there's sort of theoretical ideas about working with diversity, but again, on the basis that we'll pause and throw things open, and towards the end, perhaps just completely open it up and we'll go forwards and backwards. Does that sound like a plan? Good. Kapai, all good. So back to screen sharing. Share. It's quite an interesting process, this, because when I share the screen, I can't see any of you, so I feel a bit less. I feel there's less sort of responsiveness. But anyway, we'll keep going. So working with diversity. Now I've also got to get back to how I press the. Great. Yeah. So. I thought I'll start with ego state. One of the things, this is slightly mischievous or playful, but I am. So I thought, you know, thinking about diversity, I think about how I am diverse. And I think some of you picked up on that. It's like, well, so I have diversity within me, you know, partly through, you know, whakapapa, I have Welsh, English, and now Irish and Scottish heritage. Well, I always had that, but I didn't know it, you know. But I was thinking in terms of TA, of course, Byrne, one of the things that Byrne proposed is that we have ego states, or we can think about ourselves in terms of ego states. I think they're stories really about ourselves. But I think it's quite interesting just to pause and say, so we have ideas about having or operating from or thinking about ourselves in terms of at least 3 ego states, or 2 or 1, but again, that's another story. So I just wanted to put that out there in terms of, well, so we actually have a sort of inbuilt diversity. And if you look at things like, I once wrote a paper on change, and I did a whole lot of exploration about what is the nature of change, and realizing things like that our gut lining gets replaced after 28 days and something else gets replaced, and we are as organisms in a constant state of movement. So we have more, I believe we have more bacteria that are foreign to us than are us. So we have diversity almost at an organic biological level. So I just wanted to start off with that, because I don't want it to be diversity as something we have to take on because it's imposed by some political correctness. You know, we have diversity within us, and so when we struggle with diversity, I think we're also in some ways struggling with ourselves. I did want to acknowledge Di Salter's work on this, because if you search for articles on diversity, if you search the TAJ for articles on diversity, there's only the one article which is the discussion about theoretical diversity between Cord Steiner and Michele Novellino. But there are a couple of other articles that obviously have diversity within them. And one is Di's article on Simunye, We Are One, and she adds, we are many. And that article is a great article. If you haven't read it, I'd really recommend it. And she uses concepts of the OK Corral, which she talks the OK Kral, cultural scripting, the cultural parent and individual boundary distortions, quotes, to enable people to own and celebrate diversity while connecting with an understanding of our common humanity, which I think is something, Karen, you talking about and referring to in terms of, spiritual traditions and oneness and beingness and so on. So again, very humanistic ideas. So I did want to mihi, or to acknowledge Dai's work on that. The two areas that I'm going to talk about more, well, really for the rest of the time, and encourage us to talk about, are radical psychiatry and co-creative TA, because I think both of those traditions or approaches or aspects of TA have contributed to thinking about diversity in very particular ways. So that's what I'm going to move on to now. And in order to do that, I'm going to clarify some terms, because there are terms knocking around in TA, particularly if you start talking about radical psychiatry, which I think are sometimes used in a rather confused way, or they're used as if they're synonymous, and they're not. The first of these is social psychology. So broadly, social psychology involves the application of psychological concepts, analysis, and insights to the social world. So we might say something like, I remember one of my early articles was looking at personality adaptations in terms of organizations. So thinking about the hysterical person, the personality, and could we map that onto a hysterical organization, or the passive aggressive person and the passive aggressive organization, and so on. So it's about sort of looking at terms usually from individual psychology, putting them onto the social world. There's a separate term which Byrne uses, which is social psychiatry. And interestingly, he talked about, he referred to social psychiatry in describing the study of transactions. He's basically said that transaction analysis is a social psychiatry by virtue of the fact that we analyze transactions between two social beings or social units. And he also referred to it as the study of the personal histories and the psychodynamics of the individual motivation to transact. So although social psychiatry almost sounds a bit like radical psychiatry, it isn't. It's, from a Byrnean point of view, simply the study of transactions which are per se inherently social. But more broadly, social psychiatry as a term is used to refer to the focus of the social factors in the etiology and treatment of mental disorders. So it's a bit like, so what is your condition, the schizophrenia or whatever? What are social aspects of that in terms of, say, family history or whatever? And then the fourth term, this is by way of introducing radical psychiatry, is a particular subset of social psychiatry, which in analyzing the social factors of mental disorders takes a critical perspective. And so that's a bit more detail there, but it's basically saying we have a position, people who would identify with the radical psychiatry tradition, about alienation, oppression, institutionalization, power. Some of the early stories, of radical psychiatry. Well, I'll tell you a bit more about the history in a moment, but they're essentially taking a critical view of psychiatry. And part of the radicalism of radical psychiatry is even in the term radical psychiatry, because Steiner drew on ideas, basically talked about psychiatry as soul healing. So psychiatry from the Greek word means, or can be translated as soul healing. And so most of, in fact, all of the early radical psychiatrists were not psychiatrists. So part of the radicalism was reclaiming the word psychiatry. Now, in a regulatory society, if I called myself a psychiatrist, I'd be open to a $10,000 fine, because the term psychiatrist is protected. But from a radical perspective, we'd say, well, we're soul healers, so why don't we reclaim that term? So radical psychiatry, just a very brief bit of history. You won't be surprised to know that I'm writing about this. I've written, but I'm going to be writing about this. The next book that's coming out, hopefully before the end of the year, is a book about Claude Steiner's life and work. So there's going to be 3 chapters on radical psychiatry in there. So I'll let you know when that book comes out. But essentially, Steiner tells, and it's in this book, the story of being radicalized by his experience of a very conservative and even oppressive psychiatry. And he describes a few incidents. And this is back in the 1970s when political groups, including gay groups, were lobbying the American Psychiatric Association to take out of the DSM-3 the diagnosis or the condition of homosexuality, which was eventually taken out, I think, in 1983. But Steiner was involved in that and became radicalized. Went back to Berkeley in California, set up radical psychiatry, groups, met other people, and basically radical psychiatry was informed by a whole coalition of gay men and women, feminists, particularly very involved in gender politics, and in developing ideas about alienation and oppression, which I'll say a little bit more about. Their theoretical influences can be traced very directly back to Marx and Reich. Reich was a neo-Freudian, worked with Freud, developed body psychotherapy, and Claude learned his Marxism mostly from radical feminists, and the idea, for instance, of the stroke economy comes from Marx's theory of alienation, which is interesting because when people teach stroke economy, I don't get the sense that they teach it as a derivation, as deriving from Marx and Reich, but that is part of the history. We're talking about the late 1960s, early 70s. They quickly set up a journal, a radical therapist journal. There were inevitably splits and people moved away and set up other journals and newsletters and magazines and so on. So there's quite a rich tradition which I and a German colleague are reclaiming and putting online so that it will be available. This is probably the most quote the most synthesizes this work. It holds that all functional psychiatric difficulties are forms of alienation resulting from the mystifying oppression of people who are isolated from each other. People's alienation is a result of power abuse and is therefore a political matter. Any person in the practice of psychiatry, translated as soul healing, must become involved in the personal politics of those he or she attempts to help. And this is if you like, the two-liner. Radical psychiatry is a political theory of psychiatric disturbance and a political practice of soul healing. So their analysis, what radical psychiatry offers to our discussion about diversity, or to taking that forward, is a sense that usually diversity is some expression, or interest in diversity is some expression of oppression or previous oppression. So people sort of saying, look, I am this identity, and that is forged out of some oppressive social relations. So from this, we can consider there are two elements to radical psychiatry. One is to develop a political theory of psychological disturbance. So this would mean automatically dropping the DSM. I don't know if the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is used in South Africa. It certainly is here. And when I get hold of when I came, I was asked to teach a paper on psychopathology. So I spent most of the paper talking about health, and then the second half of the 12-week course deconstructing the DSM, because I'm following this in a way. And the second element to radical psychiatry is a political practice of therapy, which is really where the diversity action comes in. So radical psychiatry theory and I use the word praxis to describe theory and practice. And again, this is going to come out more in the book. They wrote about quite a lot. There was a really intense period from about 69 to about late 70s, with a little bit of a flurry in the late 80s. And they wrote a lot about alienation, about men's liberation and feminism for men. They're hugely informed by gender politics. Almost half there are 4 books about radical psychiatry. Half of the books or the chapters are about relationships, particularly between men and women, and to some extent gay politics. They wrote a lot about cooperation, and Steiner contributed the idea of cooperative contracting to TA, and I'll say more about this in discussion. They also wrote about couplism, monogamy and non-monogamy. Power was a big thing, social responsibility, socially responsible therapy. And that was, if you like, a bit separate from TA. And one of the things I've done in the book is to do a mapping of what's separate from TA and what comes into TA and what came into TA. Sorry, there's another bit about propaganda. The overlap with TA is the script matrix. So Steiner's original script matrix was based on an analysis of power. So he placed the child person beneath the parents in that traditional script matrix, precisely because of his analysis of power. And again, I think I'm interested in how many people present that with that backstory, because that's part of the theory. They also talked about the pig parent, the critical parent, the negative parent. They called it the pig parent because of the what people used to refer to the police as the pigs, and they defended that nomenclature till the late 80s. And basically what Claude Steiner and other radical psychiatrists thought is that our problems in the world are based on the internalized oppressive parent, and that the task of radical psychiatry is basically to confront that so that we're liberated. And they also talked about TA as a social psychology, which I referred to earlier. So those are, as I see, the overlaps with TA. And the overlap with emotional literacy, which is another area of Claude Steiner's work, is around mediation. So the practice of radical psychiatry, particularly in California, was essentially mediation work and some discussion about emotional literacy and personal power. So bringing this all together, and this is where I'm going to just one more slide, I think, or a couple of more slides, and then I'm going to go open it up again. Is two things. One is there were two radical psychiatry formulas. So how they simplified all this was to say, okay, we think that alienation equals oppression, the original oppression, plus mystification, plus isolation. What they meant by mystification is that, because they were also very influenced by Ronnie Lang, R.D. Lang's work, and Lang had this idea that as children we're hypnotized, and that's part of the oppression, that we're told how to behave, what to do, what to think, you know, that whether it's injunctions or drivers, however we think about that in TA. But he also added, he said, and then we're hypnotized to forget that we were hypnotized in the first place. And this is part of Lang's, again, slight sort of mischievous knots kind of work. You know, he wrote a book of poems called Knots, which is very knotty. But I really like that idea that it's not only that we're oppressed. So if you think of the example of somebody being abused, which is an oppression, the mystification comes in how people are told how to narrate that abuse. So it becomes, oh, it's just our secret, or it's love. And that's the mind issue. I was going to swear, but if this is going on YouTube, I probably shouldn't. But it's so when you talk to people who are abuse survivors, often they'll say it wasn't the actual abuse, it was the mind control that went with the abuse that told me that it wasn't abuse. That's the mystification. And then, of course, the isolation comes in when people are isolated and can't talk about it. So that's the alienation formula. And the counter formula is the formula for liberation is liberation equals awareness. So you become aware that you need help or whatever, or you're isolated, and therefore you want contact, and you make contact, and you go to see somebody, and then you take action, or you are helped. So therapy becomes action. And one of the slogans, I don't know if I've got it with me, on the Radical Psychiatry, Radical Therapy book is, therapy is about change, not adjustment. So this fitted very much with Burns' actionistic therapy, and Steiner contributed to that. So I'm seeing these more and more as ways of simplifying our work, particularly clinical work, to say, it's almost like a diagnostic formula. What's the oppression? What was the mystification? What was the isolation? And what's the awareness? What contact do you need to make with people? And what action do you need to take? And I do think these can work across fields. These obviously were formulated in the clinical context, but I think they have applications. And the very latest that I'm contributed to, and I've just presented this for the first time 2 weeks ago in Dunedin, because I was talking about treatment planning, and I thought I've never put treatment planning and radical psychiatry together, so I thought I'd have a go. And I thought, right, so treatment planning, the first bit is awareness, then contact, then the cooperative contract from radical psychiatry, which is no lies, no rescues, no power plays. Then demystification, which I would say involves decontamination, deconfusion, and I think in some of our contexts, decolonization, and action. So before I go on to co-creative TA, I'm going to come back to you and check in with how you're doing with the potential contribution of radical psychiatry to thinking about diversity.
I'm feeling quietly very excited about this last piece, and
quietly excited.
Yeah, I'm like feeling like lots of energy, and I want to like jump up and walk around and pace and start drawing on the walls. But
not so quiet.
When I think about so how I checked in was talking about my awareness around resilience, and this is actually a piece where I want to be moving more into the coaching work that I do, because when I look at my my biggest piece of work over the past 2 years, when I look at what is the golden thread of need out of all the people that I've worked with, it's been around resilience. And when I look at my own experience of when I was feeling least resilient, I felt completely alienated. And then my own journey of engaging with myself and connecting with life and the world again, I see elements of each one of those parts of the liberation formula. And then I see, so a significant part of that was engaging in therapy, my own therapy. So recognizing that I'm not a therapist, I'm a coach, and I'm also a coach supervisor, and looking at how does this show up in those realms, ethically and professionally. And then I was interested what you said about you brought in the DSM, and there's a therapist / coach in South Africa who she introduces herself as a recovering therapist, and she speaks about the DSM there. The presentation in particular was about the line between therapy and coaching. And she speaks about the DSM in particular, saying she finds it quite difficult to hold it in mind, where so many of the conditions have, it's a tick box exercise. So there's 10 symptoms, and it says if you've got 7 of the 10, then you've got this condition. And she was saying that, so if somebody has 7 of the 10, but then engages with a process, and then after that process only has 5 of the 10, what will a therapist do? And they say, most therapists will say, well, they still are diagnosed with it, even though currently they're not. So she was saying this distinction of most people just want to get through life. And a significant portion of humanity would technically be diagnosed as having something in the DSM. But generally, they just want to get through life. And then, so this is what makes me quite excited about what you've just shared around radical psychiatry. So thank you.
Thank you. I could say more, but I'm just wanting to pause and open this up a little bit before saying a few things about co-creative TA.
I really like the bit of liberation. Yeah, and I immediately had in mind training, which I'm planning to do in the future for volunteers, so refugees, intercultural training.
Sorry, can you lean forward a bit? Sorry, I'm struggling to hear you.
So I'm planning to do intercultural awareness training for volunteers for refugees here in Germany. And I had this liberation quotation in mind. And I had all this action in mind. So this is really about bringing awareness to what is there and where do we come from. And getting in contact and seeing who else is there and then taking action. So I think this is a formula which we really use widely in different fields, even in training and things in education. So it's really, for me, what it's behind really being an adult and being there and analyzing what is the situation. It's really
Anybody else wanting to write on the walls?
Keith, for me, what struck me significantly was the statement you showed to enable people to own and celebrate the diversity while connecting. I think that stood up wonderfully for me, very strongly for me. Because this has been bothering me. When we come from diverse backgrounds, and you also said it's about changing and not adjusting. Can I still own up to who I am and accept the change around me instead of hiding behind something and trying to adjust? And that's where I would feel oppressed and start alienating myself more. And yeah, so that I think it resonated a lot with me.
Yeah, I agree, and I think I was very mindful of your first story, and also everybody's reaction to my introduction. It's a bit like, I think if we are truly ourselves, and this speaks again to Karen's point, then I think we can meet across all sorts of divides. But if we try to twist ourselves into something we're not, or we try to adapt, or we try to say, oh, we can't have that bit of culture, or we can't tell that story, or whatever, then I think we get into problems. And of course, I suppose I should have acknowledged at the beginning, the importance of this conversation, because, we've just lost 50 people in Christchurch. Partly, we can say this was a, neo-Nazi, whatever, but I think partly because he and others like him are totally alienated for whatever reason. Maybe they feel, invaded, or they lost their culture, or whatever. I was hearing some Austrian alt-right person, but it's like, we've got to be able to talk about our cultures and our diversity and our losses. I remember talking to a woman who said, who I could have easily labeled racist. This is back in the UK, but she was talking about the sense of the loss of an England that she knew in the 1940s, 30s and 40s and 50s. And, I needed to listen to that in order to make connection, in order to bring her into diversity. It's so easy to say, oh, that's just racist, so get over yourself. Or, that would be wrong. So, yeah, I agree.
For me, because I feel that when not allowed to talk about their own identity, who they are, there's a lot of shame attached to it. So there's not going to help in connecting at time.
bearing in mind the time, I'm inclined to just show you 2 more slides that link to co-creativity and diversity, and then again throw it open. I sort of don't want to overwhelm you, but I also do want to respond to the idea of, you know, putting lots of writing on the wall. So if that's okay, I will just go back to sharing the screen and share. Can you see that? Yes, good. Yeah. So co-creative TA, I'm actually going to just skip over this for a minute. I just want to get to these 2. So I want to offer you the two and this again is the spirit of change. If the theory isn't right, change the theory, in my view. You know, or if it's not doing what you need it to do, then I'm, you know, I give myself, or I take permission to change theory. So this isn't the whole thing about co-creative stuff, but you'll obviously have the slides so you can see the full picture. But there are two diagrams that we changed a few diagrams, but one of the things that we did with the old script matrix I was describing earlier, you know, with Steiner's thing about power, is that we challenged the heteronormative assumptions of mother, father, child, and as a part of a 2-part process, we said, okay, so one of the things we're going to do is equalize the sense of influence. So Jayashri, you said earlier, you know, I don't know if I'm influencing the children I work with. And I'm going, I'm sure you do, and I hope you do. We do influence, but I think we co-influence. And so that's why we sort of described that equal movement. But the other thing was that we said, okay, we have, in this polarity, we have male and female influences. The male influences could be from father, or they could be from an uncle or a teacher or a whatever, you know, grandfather figure, some, you know, or politician or people in the public gaze. So we have lots of male influences and we have lots of female influences. We then took that one for, so our preferred idea of drawing up a script matrix is to have the subject in the middle, and then the male influences and the female influences. And then in terms of the script messages, you simply just name who the male and female influences are. But we then took that one stage further and said, how about thinking about a script helix where you have many dimensions, many polarities? So it's not just the gender polarity, but you might have a race polarity, black, white, or Māori, non-Māori. You might have a sexuality dynamic, you know. So the script helix, and we say this is a script helix. This was a particular script helix of somebody, young Asian man that I worked with in the UK, and we've mapped out all the different messages. But the point is, it's whatever script helix makes sense to you. So we're trying to say that, you know, here we have a diagram in TA, taken from TA, which is now in TA, it's been in TA for 20 years, which might explain more diversity. And in the original, or in another article I wrote with a colleague on being white, I put the story of working with the co-creative script matrix and the script helix with my work with this young Asian man. So those are just 2 offerings from, obviously, you know, theory that I've developed. But I guess the bigger picture is, you know, we have some models that may be helpful for diversity in terms of Daisolta's work, in terms of Claude Steiner's work, in terms of the co-creative, and there may be still other models, you know, yet to discover. So as I say, I won't go into a lot. I got a bit more about co-creativity, but I think that's probably enough to throw at you. It's more important for us to spend the last 10 minutes together discussing whatever else needs to be discussed. But I did want to offer you that in terms of, you know, being playful with playful with theory, I suppose.
Keith, I can't remember exactly what the name of the model was that you shared, radical psychiatry approach incorporating decolonization. I mean, I think there are a lot of other words that can be added to that as well, like perhaps more conservative ideas on family structures, on relationships, that kind of thing. And your helix format of the script matrix makes me think that if the practitioner is also coming from a more conservative background, that's certainly going to influence the work. And it becomes quite difficult to name what paradigm the practitioner is coming from, because we're also unique. We come from different parts of the world, from different schools of training, from different cultural backgrounds. You know, there are so many gradations that you could have a look at on a continuum. It's impossible to say really what the differences might be. So I was just wondering, when a person such as myself, for instance, a white 40-something-year-old male, middle class, engages with a client from a very different paradigm, whether that's socioeconomically or in terms of their sexuality, their gender, you name it, how can we ensure that the work done is healthy? Because it would be very difficult for me to even see the nuances in my own psychology, let alone my clients. And how am I checking that I'm not contaminating them with my, aspects of my paradigm which I take for granted?
That's a great question, and I guess for me some of the answer is in what you just ended with there about the nuances of your own psychology. And I think my perspective on diversity goes back to the story of me in Italy, where I think I needed to go away in order to discover who I was, and that's not an uncommon experience. I think people often talk about that sort of some epiphany where they sort of were challenged in some way. And I guess I would probably, in terms of my ideas about diversity training, is I think we have to start with ourselves. So we have to, in a sense, if there's a have to or as a suggestion, I'd say, let's look at the nuances of our psychology, perhaps using some of these ideas, or whether it's, finding your mountain, your river, your waka, in order to really be as clear as possible about your history, your motivation, and so on, because I think that makes you solid. That makes you trustworthy, not only to yourself but to clients, who work across the divide. It's taken me 10 years, I think, I was curious that I've just been here just about 10 years, and I had my first Māori client. So I've worked with a lot of Māori as colleagues, with supervisees, but I never worked with a Māori person as a client. And this guy turned up, and he wanted to do a karakia, a prayer to start the session. I ended the session with something that I knew. I think it's taken me 10 years to be here to be able to receive that person. So I think this is not easy work. I don't think it's quick work, but I think the more that we do this and the more that we apply this to ourselves and that beingness that Karen talks about, that then we're seen as trustworthy. We know people find us, people. Yeah. So I think it is about, I love your phrase, that the nuances of your psychology. Kirsty's just saying she's got to go, so. Hi, Kirsty.
Bye, Kirsty.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Lovely to see you. Thank you. Yeah, so that would be broadly what I think about that.
I'm getting the sense that also that this is long-term work, and also of being careful of being caught up in an echo chamber with regards to schools of psychology or training, and diversifying. Interesting how that word crops up here as well. Our theoretical basis, because I imagine that that in itself will be quite challenging of those nuances of our own psychology.
Yeah, I mean, if we take, that's, maybe this is another webinar, but I'm fascinated by the research, the research that suggests that it's the therapeutic relationship. In therapy, it's the therapeutic relationship that matters. And yet we're still training people in schools of psychology, including TA, when the factors of technique are minuscule in terms of therapeutic outcome. Doesn't matter what you do. It probably matters, your adherence to your model matters a bit, but nothing matters more than the therapeutic relationship, apart from extra therapeutic factors. So I'm thinking, why don't we spend 40% of our time training on this extra therapeutic stuff, radical psychiatry, diversity, context, sociology, all of that, 30% on the therapeutic relationship, looked at from diverse plural perspectives, and 15% on the client and 15% on, if you like, techniques. That would be a very different training. And that evidence has been around for a quarter of a century, and yet people are still sticking with, mostly with orientation-specific training. I'm smiling because I'm feeling very Portici, very, very third son. I don't know about your kaupapa, your sort of protocol about ending, but I'm just wondering, I've sensed it would be nice to hear from everybody, even just a few sentences about how it's been, and what you're taking away. And I've probably talked a bit too much, but I suppose I'd rather give you more than less.
Keith? I am still left with confusion, because in India we have a lot of, I mean, nowadays we are seeing a lot of this, caste-based honor killing of the daughters or this. And just yesterday I watched a movie where, based on the caste, a few children are, and that was based on a true story. And it was, so when I came back home, I was talking to my son. My son has grown up learning some things about this, but I've never really talked about how, what they have, the caste system in India. And so my son really doesn't know, because I have not behaved that way. Of course, he knows I'm from the highest. We are Brahmins and we have our own customs and we are following it. Beyond that, I don't think he really knows about his friends' religions or what their customs are. And so when I was telling him the story yesterday about, so he was quite taken aback, and he's 16 years old. So I was, how much of that history would, talking to him about it, of the history of how there was oppression, there is oppression, and now the oppression the upper caste feel because of the reservations for the lower caste. That dialogue, if I, that he is not exposed to any of this as of now. So yesterday's, when I told him about the story of the movie, there's some thoughts coming in to him. My experience growing up in a Brahmin household was different. So my mother was quite conventional, and she wouldn't even allow a cousin who got married into a different Hindu religion to really come into the kitchen or something like that. And now I have employed people of different religions, so it's not, my sons don't know that. So how much of this history or that ancestry do I own up to. So I'm not, am I confusing him, or am I helping him understand himself?
I really appreciate the question, and I feel somewhat humbled to even think about constructing an answer, because I'm not you and I'm not living in your life and so on. But I think two things. One is slightly humorous idea that somebody told me once that confusion is the state before enlightenment. Okay. So in some ways, when people are confused, I'm sort of going, great, that's probably good idea. But more seriously, I would tend to think, why maybe I put it as a form of a question, why wouldn't you tell your son about your history and about that transition? It's rather like Andrew said about, and I think others have talked about the movement. No, it was Denise talking about, sorry, somebody was talking about the movement of their family. I think that history is part of his heritage. It's part of his, what Māori would say was the whakapapa, the layers. And that story, about how you have moved from, what your mother did to what you're doing. So I, on the whole, would probably advise sort of more sharing of history. We're losing Sharon as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I know we're on time, but I'm also up for hearing from people, just by the way it feels like the process is more important than time boundary. But I'm a bit in your hands, Alex. I don't know if that's a major boundary issue. But if basically I'm available to just finish in a reasonably expansive way, rather than cut off. Is that acceptable?
Let's open it up to the group. I have a few more minutes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I need to go,
right.
But this was so enlightening. But yeah, it feels as if it was, the very, very tiny steps. So I also look forward to getting the slides, Keith, and to ponder some more. So thank you very, very much. I really appreciate all of it.
Good to meet you. Thank you.
Likewise. Bye.
I'm going to unmute while people say goodbye. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate people need to leave. Please leave and that's on. But it's just in terms of closing.
I take lots of things. And I really liked your question, Alex. How can we work with people now? Yeah, in a way that we see them as they are. I'd put it in my words, and that's a really tricky thing. So and this is for me all of this thing of this crisis around this matter really. So thank you so much. I don't know. There's some reason why she's waiting now. I don't know why it's that. And so,
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Keith, thank you very much for this webinar. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I think that I kind of solved my problem, so I think I should be okay for this. You've given me a lot of food for thought, and I've been in particular very taken with the radical psychiatry formulae and looking at how one would apply that in an organizational context. So for me, I was looking and thinking of organizational alienation, and looking at oppression, mystification, and isolation in the workplace, specifically in terms of diversity. And for me, I can very easily think of, picture, identify aspects of oppression, and I think that is that is the way we oppress each other in the workplace through company politics is evident. It's all over, and you can see it quite easily. You can also, for me, spot quite easily aspects of isolation, so groups or individuals who are isolated and marginalized in the workplace. The mystification has fascinated me, and that's something that I would like to read more about. and to think more about in terms of how that is formed, how that exists in the workplace, and the idea of the hypnotized once and twice. So I've been trying to actually think of examples of that. There's something for me around mystification taking place through company vision, missions, and values. But I need to think about that some more. And then, this hypnotized twice, I think that I can identify some of that or have seen some of that in the way people in the workplace will justify or push aside what may be identified as racism or sexism by saying it's not because we treat everyone that way.
Yes, everybody's
Things
equal.
like that, so wonderful. Giving me some very exciting food for thought. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. And I would be interested in maybe taking this forward in terms of further communication about diversity training, maybe leading to an article or some writing. Yeah, so I'll be up for that and thinking with you about that.
Wonderful. Great. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you. Karen, Andrew, Alex, who else have we got?
Yeah, I found the formula very eye-opening. It's certainly given me more food for thought, and I think what I would like, perhaps, Keith, is some resources, if you could share something with us for further reading. Please.
I'll certainly send you a link to the radical psychiatry stuff that's getting put online. So that will give you access, because most of the books are, they're not, there's no e-versions, they're just, but I can send you lists of references and so on. So I'll add that to the slides. Okay, good.
Andrew, I'm going to thank Keith at the end, so I'm going to wait till the end. So over to you if you want to say some words.
Oh, you're going. Okay.
I wondered if that was happening. So I think so. What I'm really sitting with at the moment is coming out of, Keith, your story about being in Italy and that sense of actually I am British, and then I was kind of testing that mindset with myself and the different sort of elements that I fit under. So I'm a white male in South Africa. So and how do I accept that and live into that, and at the same time enable myself to show up in the best ethical, inclusive way, and do the work that I'm passionate about doing, and then also me as a gay man, how do I show up, and how do I not be apologetic for who I am so I can show up more powerfully, and then thinking about linking that into my own journey of defining my best flavor of life, and the more I live into that, the more I can attract the work that I want to be doing, and be more potent. That's what I'm sitting with, and I'm really humbled and excited at the same time. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, as I'm the guest, I'll finish with a farewell from me before handing the mori, or the energy, back to Sata and Karen. So ngā mihi nui kia koutou, ngā mihi mahana kia koutou, ke te mihi ahau ki o mahi, ki o kaupapa, ki o aroha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So briefly, I've acknowledged your wisdom, your protocols, your love, your compassion, your work, and I've signed off by saying not only goodbye to you, but goodbye to you, including me. So tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thanks, Keith. Gosh, briefly what I've got from it, it was fascinating hearing more of Claude Steiner's rationale for his radical psychiatry. I've caught odds and ends at conferences, but it really has brought to life, for example, the script matrix, realizing he drew it like that, not because he believed it should be like that, but it was a reflection of what he saw as unequal power in his time. So those pieces were really, really interesting. It was lovely to see your script helix and to let you know, I don't know if you know David Gibson, the Canadian brother who's a TSTA. I was doing some work with some of his brothers in his order from all around South Africa. And we were talking about diversity, and he went up to the board and he said, oh, there's somebody that draws it like this. So there it was being shared with a range of brothers from all around Africa, and it really, really made sense to them. Keith, thank you for your beingness. It really was tangible. That's the piece that came across despite the electronic way of us meeting. It really is tangible. So thank you for that very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you again for inviting me. And as I said last time, this is last time was not the last time. I hope this time is not the last time. I would be delighted to meet you again, next year. And I'm serious about the furtherance of a diversity project. If there's energy for putting the wisdom that you have, because I didn't hear so much because I was, was more presenting. But if there is something to follow up afterwards, I'd be, in principle, up for some conversations by email or whatever. So, thank you. Anything else from you, Alex, in terms of protocol, or is that it? So, once again,
thank you so much for your time.
You all. Yeah, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you.